Revelation chapter 11. It is Thursday, October the 23rd. Today is my father's birthday.
Happy birthday.
He's been dead for 15 years, so, but it's still his birthday. My father, huh?
Yeah, Ben, if you would.
Oh, he was born in 1926. He would be 88, I guess, 2014.
Died young, huh?
He died of cancer just before he turned 71. Brain cancer. Too much smoking, too much asbestos, and too much smoking, too much asbestos. Okay, we're in Revelation chapter 11. And as I find it in my notes here, we're going to be looking at, first of all, like the two witnesses. We are actually in the middle between the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet. So let's go ahead and like read our text, or at least the first part of the text here in Revelation, so that we are, and see the introduction that John gives. Okay. So Revelation chapter 11, chapter 11, verse 1. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, Arise and measure the temple of God, the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands before the God of the earth, and if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heaven, so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. Okay, so this brings in the two witnesses, and of course, Revelation 11, just like a lot of other chapters, there's going to be a lot of mystery, and so as we look at these two witnesses, okay. Hey Kurt, how you doing? Okay. So as we look at the two witnesses, we're going to we'll see some similarities to them and some other Old Testament figures, but first we're going to look at some of the diverse opinions that you can find in different commentaries about these two witnesses. And they usually fall in like three different categories. Like commentators try to figure out, did they do their ministry in the first half of the tribulation or in the second half? And then there's usually a running commentary or battle as to whether they are either Moses or Elijah or Enoch or John the Baptist or some other figure. So there's going to be a lot of debate as to who these witnesses are. So what I did was, before I actually give my opinion, the correct opinion for this class, not really, but my intent on this class isn't to indoctrinate you, is to give you the evidence, at least no matter how I skew the evidence to make me look like I'm right all the time. But what I try to do is I try to give you enough information so that on these fundamental positions, like we're not arguing about whether we're pre-trib or post-trib or something like that. We're just trying to figure out who the witnesses are, and amongst fundamentalists who are pre-tribulational, premillennial, they just have these differences of opinion, and they're all going on different sets of evidences to try to, they weigh different evidence to see who the two witnesses are. So for instance, I'll go over a number of biblical scholars and just give you some of their opinions. So those who say that the two witnesses ministered in the first half of the tribulation would be, for instance, like Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, okay? He believes two men God raises up, two Jewish men during the tribulation, okay? Dr. Chuck Missler, anybody familiar with Chuck Missler? Okay, he used to be Chuck Smith's main Bible teacher. Chuck Missler used to have like 1,000 people that would attend his Bible studies in his Sunday school class and stuff like that. For instance, Dr. David Newton was one of his avid pupils. So every time, like we're in home group together, so when prophetic sorts of themes kind of come up, I can hear Chuck Missler coming out of his mouth because he was very well indoctrinated. Well, taught. I was just say not indoctrinated, but taught. And one that Bob you'll be familiar with is Dr. J. Vernon McGee.
Oh yes.
Okay. I tease him because you don't meet many McGees around. So he believes that they're going to be Elijah and John the Baptist, and he typically believes, you know, that they ministered during the first half of the tribulation. Dr. Charles Ryrie, professor of systematic theology at Dallas Theological Seminary, Ryrie leaves the witnesses unidentified. Okay, I've learned that the more scholarly the Bible writer is, the less opinionated they are in who it is. And it just kind of works out that way. Hal Lindsey, writer of Late Great Planet Earth and New World Coming back in the 70s, he believes they're Moses and Elijah, and also that they, you know, of course, that they witnessed during the first half of the tribulation. So if you believe what Hal Lindsey believed, and say if you're my age or maybe a little bit younger or something like that, and you read his books as they were coming out, you would have been completely sure, you know, that anything that Hal Lindsey said was correct. Okay, but since Christ didn't come back in 1988, some of his information might be suspect. So it just means you have to test everything. Dr. Tim LaHaye, he believes that they're Moses and Elijah, and in his commentary in the Book of Revelation. Dr. Gary Cohen wrote a book with Salim Kurban. They believe it's Moses and Elijah. Here you have a Messianic Jew and a Christian Arab that got together and they wrote a book on Revelation. Okay, then there's those people that believe that the two witnesses witnessed during the second half of the tribulation. Let me kind of like draw that up here, just to give you an idea. What I'm doing here, and obviously I have my own opinion too, and I've vacillated on my opinion, is because when I see a certain scholar make certain statements, and I know how much they study, and I know how much they do in other works of the Bible. You know, sometimes their words can carry more weight than, and in other words, they're able to sway me too. So, like for instance, during the first half of the tribulation, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, and he's a Messianic Jew. Still speaks with a German accent. I learned with one of the students last year, I used to say Fruchtenbaum, so I said, how do you actually say it in German? And she said, it's Fruchtenbaum. Okay, so I was pretty close. I don't have the accent quite right, but that's what it is. Okay, Chuck Missler, J. Vernon McGee. Okay.
Vernon McGee said it was Elijah and who?
John the Baptist.
John the
Oh,
Baptist.
John the Baptist. Yeah.
Is it possible that they're just like two random guys we've never heard of?
Oh, let me finish this, and that's going to be.
That means no.
No, actually, it doesn't.
Okay, all right.
I just don't want him stealing my thunder. Okay. Dr. Charles Ryrie. I mean, when Ryrie says something, you gotta really consider. I mean, he wrote the Ryrie Study Bible, right? I mean, he wrote all the notes for that. Tim LaHaye, everybody knows Tim LaHaye from the Left Behind series now. I mean, who doesn't know Tim LaHaye? Anybody not familiar with Tim LaHaye?
Is he the guy who wrote the Left Behind series?
He wrote the Left Behind series with a guy named Jenkins. Tim LaHaye wrote like a lot of books back in the 70s. He started Christian Heritage College, which is now San Diego Christian College, and the Institute for Creation Research. Basically, they all used to meet on the same campus and everything. Well, it used to be Scott Memorial Baptist Church. Now it's Shadow Mountain Church, and David Jeremiah is the pastor there now. I tell people I knew David Jeremiah when he had brown hair. Because he used to come as a guest speaker when Tim LaHaye wasn't there. He'd come in and speak. And then lo and behold, when Tim LaHaye and his wife quit and did a marriage ministry, David Jeremiah came in and took over. So Tim LaHaye. If you look at these names, and then I guarantee you, if you look at some Christian books, you'll recognize who those names are. Like there's like 10 books in the Left Behind series or something. In fact, the new movie that came out with is it any good?
It was okay, I guess.
Okay. Well, the first one was pretty slow going too. Basically, Tim LaHaye wrote the book that's based on the Left Behind. In fact, I think that was the name of the book. So, and then of course, Dr. Gary Cohen. Okay, second half of tribulation, Dr. Mark Hitchcock. I'm putting up authors where if you do a lot of study and prophecy and stuff, you're going to run across these names. And I try to get some modern names as well as some older names too. Mark Hitchcock is a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary. And in other words, he was taught by Charles Ryrie and Dwight Pentecost and Dr. Merrill Unger and J. Vernon McGee. I mean, back when McGee was like a visiting professor at Dallas back then. Dr. John Walvoord. Now he was a theologian. He was the president of Dallas Theological Seminary. Back he took Dr. Louis Sperry Schaefer's place, and Walvoord is basically he is still known as the dean of Bible prophecy. In other words, if anything you want to know about Bible prophecy, you went to Dr. John Walvoord. By the way, he was 6'6", so like when he got in debates and stuff like that, nobody argued with him. Okay, just kidding. Okay. And then one of my favorites, Dr. John MacArthur. Okay. Dr. John MacArthur. Okay. They believe the two witnesses did their ministry in the second half of the tribulation. And I'm going to give you evidence, so like after we read the text, we're going to go over some of the evidence, and like if you put up a timeline of what's going on in the tribulation period, you'll just see it's difficult to really pin it down. And you can argue for both. The non-committal time frame. Now I'm going to answer your question right now. Okay. Chuck Smith, non-committal. He says Elijah's the first, the second is Moses, or it could be Enoch, or it could be Zerubbabel. That was Chuck Smith's position, at least when he wrote his commentary on the book of Revelation. David Levy, he's with the Jewish organization today. He's not uncommitted. If they come from the past, he says Moses and Elijah, or they would be two witnesses that are raised up during the tribulation period, which is like what you said, two random guys. Well, obviously they wouldn't be random guys, maybe from our perspective, but maybe there'll be people that are raised up during the tribulation period that are kind of like in the spirit of Moses and Elijah, much like John the Baptist was raised up in the power and spirit of Elijah when he did his ministry. Other scholars' views. If you go back a few years, Dr. Seiss, and he has a really good commentary on Revelation. He believes Enoch and Elijah. Gavitt, Enoch and Elijah. Dean Alford, Moses and Elijah. Walter Scott, Moses and Elijah. Donald Gray Barnhouse, the guy that actually trained Dr. Walter Martin, he believes Moses and Elijah. And then William Newell, whom J. Vernon McGee says is one of the smartest men he ever met, especially when it comes to this. He says he does not even attempt to identify them. And McGee said that's the smartest person yet. Just didn't even come up with a guess. He just said, I don't know. Okay. So, and these are all, like scholars and stuff like that. So you can have like fun with this, but as we look at part of the text and everything, you'll start to, you'll get a flavor. And of course, when I just read the part of the text again, you'll form an opinion. I'm just putting up that no matter what side that you choose, you're going to be in good company. But let me repeat what J. Vernon McGee always used to say. If you choose this side or that side, you'll be in very good company. But if you want to be right, you're going to come along with me. So you're going to come along with me. That's how McGee always used to say it. Okay, so let's look at what they do. Okay, so there's going to be two witnesses, and before we do that, though, hold your place in Revelation and go ahead and turn back to Zechariah chapter 4. Zechariah chapter 4. It's in the Old Testament, very close to the end of the Old Testament. There's going to be, if you work backwards, Malachi, Haggai, Zechariah. Okay.
I got Zephaniah.
You don't want Zephaniah, you want Zechariah. Zechariah.
Second to the last book.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I put Haggai first. I was going forwards.
Yeah.
Anyway, chapter 4. And we're going to read something here because the two witnesses are basically taken out of this. And of course, in Zechariah, they're going to be Joshua the high priest, and they're going to be Zerubbabel, who's the governor of the land. That's who the two witnesses are back in the days of Zechariah. After the return from the captivity from Babylon, God raised up two prophets together to get them to build the temple. Haggai was basically he was the practical one, like the book of James. The people said, we need to be more spiritual. What must we do? And then Haggai said, well, there's the hill, there's the lumber. Go down, cut down the trees, cut lumber, make beams and stuff like that, and build the temple. In other words, get to work. He said, there's a lot of physical labor that needs to be done to build a temple. Do that and you'll be spiritual. That was his. Whereas Zechariah had his head in the clouds, and he had like 8 or 10 visions, depending upon how you divide them up. And so like you had the visionary Zechariah, and then you had the practical person, Haggai, who was, the work at hand that needed to be done. But both of them spoke about the kingdom that was going to come at the end of the age after this period right here. So in chapter 4, you have the vision of the lampstand and the olive trees. Okay, I'm just going to read, I could read the whole chapter here. I want you to get the context that Revelation chapter 11 is written about. It says, now the angel who talked with me and came back and wakened me as a man who is awakened out of his sleep, and he said to me, what do you see? So I said, I am looking, and there is a lampstand of solid gold with a bowl on top of it, and on the stand 7 lamps with 7 pipes to the 7 lamps. 2 olive trees are by it, one at the right of the bowl and the other at its left. So I answered and spoke to the angel who talked with me, saying, what are these, my Lord? Then the angel who talked with me answered and said to me, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. So he answered and said to me, this is the word of Jehovah to Zerubbabel. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. I mean, it's probably a memory verse for a lot of you there. Who are you, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you shall become a plain, and he shall bring forth the capstone with shouts of grace, grace to it. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hand shall also finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For who has despised the day of small things? For these 7 rejoice to see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. They are the eyes of Jehovah, which scan to and fro throughout the whole earth. Then I answered and said to him, what are these 2 olive trees at the right of the lampstand and at the left? And I further answered and said to him, what are these 2 olive branches that they drip into the receptacle of the 2 gold pipes from which the golden oil drains? And he answered me and said, do you not know what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. So he said, these are the 2 anointed ones who stand beside the Lord of the whole earth. Okay. So that's the context for Revelation chapter 11. If you can understand Zechariah chapter 4, you start to get a handle of Revelation chapter 11. And since I just read it quick, and if you haven't read that before, Revelation 11 probably makes about as much sense now as it did before I read Zechariah. So what I'm going to do, I want to draw what he's doing there, because when it shows the menorah, the menorah that is depicted in the book of Exodus, which was first drawn. Okay, remember, orange is my color for gold because you can't see yellow. Okay, so I guess I'll get that during the break. Here's, in the Old Testament, remember you had the menorah. Okay, it's just going to be a simple drawing. And of course you had cups on top. Actually, there were like almond blossoms on top. Okay. Okay, so it's the menorah. We say menorah in English, but it's really menorah in Hebrew. You always accent like the last syllable. So, you got the 7 candlesticks, but remember, in the temple or in the tabernacle or the temple, there would be priests that would go in and they would have to put the golden oil in it. In other words, the olive oil. Anybody ever seen olive oil? Mm-hmm. It's golden colored, so it's a picture of the Holy Spirit. And they would put the oil in, and then they would light the candles, okay? So in other words, the way that they got their oil is that the priests supplied the oil, okay? In the book of Revelation, you don't have the 7 candlesticks. You have, remember when we talked about the candlesticks in Revelation chapter 4, there were 7 separate candlesticks with the Son of Man. The resurrected Christ, he's walking between the candlesticks and he's dressed like a priest, like the high priest. So they're separated there in Revelation. In Zechariah 4, it's going to be a little bit different again. And so I'm going to take the menorah here. And as we look at Zechariah 4, and contrast it with the book of Exodus, you have your menorah here, but then you're going to have, it mentions 2 olive trees. So here's one tree. Here's the second tree. Okay. Okay. I know it's I know you know what an olive tree looks like, but just picture this as being a really neat looking olive tree. Okay, and you got a branch. There's a branch hanging out here, and there's a branch hanging out here. Basically, I'm just drawing, what's being pictured in Zechariah chapter 4, and of course you got there's foliage and olives and stuff on it, and then they've got these pipes. Actually, they go into a bowl first. Let me do this accurately. I don't want to give you the wrong picture here. Okay. We have this, there's this golden bowl. Okay. And the oil is being dumped from the two branches. And then out of this bowl here, you have an unending supply of olive oil coming down to light the light in the menorah. Okay, that's kind of what is pictured in Zechariah chapter 4. In Zechariah chapter 4, the witnesses are Joshua. And that's the anglicized Hebrew name, but it's really, if you use the Greek spelling, it's this. It's Jesus, it's Jesus, and this is Zerubbabel. By the way, Zerubbabel, Zerah is the Hebrew word for seed. He was born in Babylon, Babel. Basically, his name means seed of confusion. Okay. So Joshua, in other words, that's why McGee could come up, or some of them could come up with, oh, well, maybe it's going to be Zerubbabel. He says, well, where'd that name come from? It comes from Zechariah chapter 4. So there are the two witnesses back then, but in Revelation chapter 11, now we have this picture coming from Zechariah chapter 4. But then we really don't know who the two witnesses are, okay? So first of all, what we do know about them, they're going to witness, they're going to minister for 42 months. Actually, it says, and I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days. So 1,260 days, which happens to be 42 months or 3.5 years. So in other words, they're going to witness this period of time, and then they're going to be identified by what they do. Now, remember, we're not given their names, but there are going to be evidences as to who they are. So first of all, it states in verse 4, these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. Okay, there's your picture out of Zechariah. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. Now, does that sound like anybody in the Old Testament? Who's that sound like? Elijah. Sounds like Elijah. Remember, King Ahab would send groups of 50 soldiers? Actually, the commander, and then there's 50 soldiers, and there'd be like 51 soldiers. And remember, they would ask, are you Elijah? And remember, Elijah would say, well, if I'm Elijah and if I'm a prophet of the Lord, let fire come down from heaven and devour you. And then remember that big ball of fire would come down and they'd all be killed. And that happened twice. So like, in other words, another 50 men die. And then another 50 men get sent out. In other words, Ahab says, we'll send 50 more. But the third commander fears God. He fears Jehovah. So he falls down and comes crawling up to Elijah, begging him to not to destroy he and his men. And so, again, you get that picture then that Elijah is the one who called down fire from heaven. And of course, we have in Malachi where, remember, it says that he will show up before the great and terrible day of the Lord. In other words, when the day of the Lord occurs, Elijah is going to come too. So you have that kind of evidence that it's going to be, one of the witnesses will be Elijah. So let's just call this guy Elijah. Okay. Eliyahu in Hebrew, or anybody know what Elijah means? Elijah, my God, and then Jah is abbreviation for Jehovah. My God is Jehovah. Okay. Remember, this is what Jesus cried from the cross. Eli, Eli, remember? Okay. Remember, and what do they think when Jesus was crying out from the cross? He's calling on Elijah. Okay. So Elijah could be one of the witnesses. So that's where the evidence that they have there. The next one, if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have power to shut heavens so that no rain falls, and in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over waters to turn them to blood. Now,
That's definitely Elijah.
turn water to blood?
No, but hold back the rain.
Hold back the rain, yeah. And by the way, Elijah, remember back in his day, during the days of Ahab, during that famine, remember it didn't rain for 3.5 years? During the tribulation period, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. Yeah, good point. I should have brought that up too. Who had power to turn waters into blood?
Moses.
Or the authority to turn water into blood? Of course, Moses. So the two obvious choices are Moses and Elijah. And of course, they're the ones that have, there's special circumstances for Moses, because remember when he died, when it was time for him to die, remember God buried him so that nobody would know. And then of course it says in the book of Jude that Michael the archangel was in a standoff with Lucifer or Satan as to the disposition of Moses' body. And so there's just the fact that why would that even be brought up? And so there's reasons to believe that Moses, who never got to enter the promised land, will get the chance to enter the promised land during the Great Tribulation period, or during the tribulation period. The other people who are put in there, one of them is, for instance, Enoch. So some people will say it's going to be Elijah and Enoch, you know, from Genesis chapter 5, because Enoch never died and Elijah never died. They were taken up to heaven bodily. Remember Elijah in the whirlwind, chariots of fire. And remember Enoch walked with God. First he was there, then he was not, for God took him. And so when Enoch was at the paltry young age of 365, was basically taken up to heaven. J. Vernon McGee would say that Enoch and Enoch and God were walking together, you know, in fellowship. And then one day, you know, it's getting late, and then Enoch is realizing, you know, it's getting late in the day, and then God just basically said to him, you know, you're closer to my house than you are to your house. Why don't you just come home with me? That's how McGee explains it. But anyway, these are the two biggest witnesses, and of course, then you have all the other various opinions and stuff like that. If you just go by the miracles and stuff, and if you believe that these people are coming back from the Old Testament, because there are promises in the Old Testament that Elijah's coming back, then you're going to end up with Moses and Elijah.
They were both on the Mount of Configuration, or Transfiguration.
Yeah, yeah. There's a whole lot of other evidence, you know, in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the Transfiguration, when the two, you know, when Peter is up there with Peter, John, and James, when they're up there, and when Jesus is transfigured before them, in other words, his glory starts shining through his earthly body, then they walk into a cloud, the Shekinah glory that surrounds them, and then two other persons appear, Moses and Elijah, and they're talking about the second coming of Christ. And so because of those things, they're kind of like saying that it's Moses and Elijah. Yeah.
If it is Moses, does that mean he dies twice?
Yes, but would that be a problem?
No, because God can do anything.
Yeah, but think about it. Most people point to that verse in Hebrews 9 where it's appointed unto men once to die and after that the judgment. Well, obviously, there's always exceptions to the rule because Elijah didn't die, Enoch didn't die, Lazarus was raised from the dead and he died again. And of course, all the people that Jesus raised from the dead, you know, they died again. In other words, they were resuscitated, they weren't resurrected into a glorified body. So there's always exceptions to the rule. So it's hard to pick a verse like, it is appointed unto men once to die and after that the judgment. You can't use that as a hard and fast rule because there's always examples of not dying. And what's the biggest example of not dying of all?
Jesus.
Jesus died.
He died.
The biggest example of not dying.
The people who were on the earth during the revelation, during the tribulation.
How about, well, a lot of people are going to die.
Oh, the rapture.
The rapture, I mean, if Christ came back now, none of us will have the opportunity to die. You'll miss that experience.
That's okay.
Oh. So, in other words, so then that statement is appointed unto men once to die, and after that the judgment isn't true in all situations. So you don't want to proof text. You know, another you can pick verses to like demonstrate any point, but if you have to look at what are the boundaries for the verse, and what are the exceptions to the rule and stuff. You get that a lot. Like for instance, when you go in the book of Proverbs, people will read a proverb, and people think that God is, most say Christians believe that God is giving promises in the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs are not promises. You know, like train up a child in the way that he shall go, and he will not depart from it. Not only is that interpreted wrongly, it's not even translated very well, but it's just a they're general principles. Because, you know, Proverbs will state things, you know, that the righteous live a righteous life, you'll live a long life. If you're wicked, you'll die young. Well, Psalm 73, the book of Job, why do the righteous suffer? Why do the righteous die young? Ecclesiastes, why do wicked people seem to lead long, long lives, and the righteous people are poor and are downtrodden and stuff? There's always exceptions to the rule. So like Proverbs will give you general principles, but not promises. So you got to be careful when you proof text, you know, that you're not proof texting, because you can make your case, but it doesn't mean that it's true. So that's why, again, like the pastor says, you need the whole counsel of God in order to understand what's going on. So anyway, my opinion is that it's Moses and Elijah. Generally speaking, most of the time that I've studied Revelation, which has been for like 45 years now, I've been studying Revelation, I've typically believed that they witnessed in the first half of the tribulation period. And I know John MacArthur, our textbook, says different. But again, there's a lot of good people on both sides. But I'm going to give you my reasons for why I think they're going to witness in the first half of the tribulation. I mean, the reasons that sway me. It doesn't mean that I can't be swayed that they'll be on the other side, but I'll give you evidence for both. And then, to the best of my ability, I will try to not skew the evidence for one side or the other. I'll just give you some of the evidence, because otherwise we'd be here for several hours discussing it. And after a while, most of you might be saying, well, who cares? You know, okay? Yeah. It reminds me of Chuck Missler had this saying that he was, you know, when he was like a CEO of like 33 different companies. And he was a CEO of this one company that used to make digital watches and time clocks and chronographs and stuff like that. And this one person, one of the engineers there, said, we have a timepiece that is so accurate, it will only lose 1 second in 100,000 years. And Chuck Missler thought about it and immediately said, after thinking about it, first of all, how do you know? And second, who cares? Okay. And I mean, really think about it. Unless you're going to go out there and catch a satellite or something like that, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good. So evidence for one half or the other. And the way I present this evidence is going to be as we're going through the text. I'm going to present things that become problems if they're in one side or the other. Okay. So as I look at the second part of the text here, first of all, we know that there's going to be a drought for 3.5 years. Okay, that could be first half or the second half. But then we're going to look at some other things that are going to be going on. And as we remember, as we've talked about this being the Great Tribulation on this side right here, and remember the sixth bowl, the seven trumpets, I'm sorry, the sixth seal bringing in the day of the Lord, and then the seven trumpets and the seven bowls. I'm going to just kind of put them up there real quick. So here's the sixth seal, and then there's these trumpets.
So we're sure the trumpets are on that side of
What's that?
the tribulation, right?
Yes, I'm teaching chronological. Virtually every really sharp Bible scholar, the ones that I'm calling sharp, Dr. John Wolvard, Dr. John MacArthur, J. Vernon McGee, they're all going to see chronological. Okay.
Because the first 4 seals are on that side.
Yeah, seals number 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the fifth seal, when it's open on this side, but it either takes place here or it refers to the whole thing. You can argue for both. This is the fifth seal. Remember, that's the prayers of the martyrs that are underneath the altar. In other words, under the altar, they're under the blood. In other words, they're saved. So, and then you've got the seven bowls. Didn't leave myself enough room for those. Okay, so you got your trumpets and bowls. Okay, let's start off this first. If the two witnesses are in the Great Tribulation, what evidence that we have for that? Well, it talks about them bringing about plagues. Okay, so the plagues, are these the plagues that the two witnesses are calling forth from heaven? Because like when we read Revelation, of course, it's Jesus Christ that's the one that's sending them. But from an earthly perspective, are the two witnesses calling down the plagues from heaven? If they are, it's only in Revelation chapter 11 that we would see that. But it doesn't specifically say that. It just says that they're able to do all manner of plagues. Okay, so let's kind of look at the verse here. The hardest thing for me to understand if they're here is the timing of events that happen in the Great Tribulation. Okay, so as I read the account of the witnesses being killed in Revelation 11:7 through 10, it states, "When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit," by the way, this is the first mention of the beast, which he'll be talked about a lot in chapter 13. "But when he ascends out of the bottomless pit, he will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days." Okay, so the question then becomes, and I'll use a different color here, if they witness in the first half, and it talks about the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. All right, does he immediately kill them here at the end of their ministry, and you got these two guys, laying dead in the street? Okay, two witnesses. Okay, are they here, or are they here? That's how I draw dead bodies. Okay, okay. The beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. In other words, that's going to be the future Antichrist. Which, by the way, Antichrist is not used in the book of Revelation. It's only used like in 1st and 2nd John. John in Revelation, he calls that person the beast. Okay, the wicked beast. Okay, and so when the beast ascends out of the pit, that happens here. Beast comes out of the pit. Okay, he rises up. And so is he killing the witnesses after they do their ministry in the first half of the tribulation? Is there warning everybody what's about to come upon them, and then the 144,000 are sealed, for the rest of the ministry? And then, of course, right in the middle here, it's going to mention something that they're going to, it says verse 6, and their dead bodies will be in the street of the great city, in Jerusalem. Then those peoples and tribes and tongues will see their dead bodies for 3.5 days. Worldwide television, in other words, everybody in the world is going to see these guys rotting in the streets of Jerusalem. And they won't allow their bodies to be put into the grave. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another. So in other words, there's this merrymaking and all that stuff, which for me, now this sways me to put it here. This is one of the evidence that I use, where I put the two witnesses here. They have time, and the beast is in enough control where worldwide television, if that's what's being used, the whole world can view these dead bodies rotting in the streets, mortifying, puffing up. If you've ever seen dead bodies, it's pretty gruesome, okay? And so it happens here. He makes war with them and he kills them. He allows them to lie in the streets. After 3.5 days, there's going to be a voice from heaven, and they're going to be raised from the dead. And before worldwide television, these guys are going to stand up and all of a sudden get resurrection bodies, and they're going to be assumpted up into heaven. Then there's going to be an earthquake that's going to, in Jerusalem, that's going to kill 7,000 people. 7,000 mighty people in Jerusalem. If it happens here, I can understand that better than if it happens here. Because if it happens here towards the end after 3.5 years, that puts it right back at the very end, in which case the bowl judgments are being poured. What I don't understand, if that's the case, is are they in any condition to be able to have a party being thrown worldwide and sending gifts to each other if they're killed here? And then, of course, immediately Armageddon is happening and the second coming is happening, and it almost seems like if these guys are killed and rise from the dead here, it's almost like anticlimactic for what's about to occur. I mean, for me, that's what drives me to put them in the first half. Chronologically, in the book of Revelation, if this chapter is, because I treat this chapter like it's meanwhile back at the ranch. In other words, now it's telling you stuff that's going over the entire tribulation period, just like chapter 7. So for me, for Hal Lindsey, and say for all those other scholars that put them in the first half of the tribulation, that's typically the reason that they do that, because it just, like I say, it seems very anticlimactic that he's killing these two witnesses, but at the same time he's preparing for the, he's literally going to be marching to Armageddon, where he's going to be killed by Christ himself at the second coming. And it's like, they don't have time to be watching TV and watching these guys rot in the streets, and because all these bowl judgments and everything are going off rapidly too. So for me, that's why I put them in the first half, because I can't conceive of how that would work. To me, there's just too many things going on. I mean, obviously I can be wrong, but that's my reasoning now, and not even MacArthur has even been able to swing my opinion that it's in the second half. He's taken it just chronologically. This is where it occurs. So anyway, here's what happens to him. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. So we know that for 3.5 days they're sending gifts to one another. So because there's no actual time frame given in Revelation 13, it's very, again, that's why there's differences of opinion. Okay, and it's like some really respected Bible scholars, just disagree on this. Yeah.
You talked about being right at the beginning or right in the middle. Does anybody believe, well, after when they're halfway in between the first, like 2 months into the tribulation, these guys could come on the scene, and then that then that would be a couple of years before the final.
That's the answer I would like to hear, but it's pretty tough to do that because in Revelation 11, when it starts off, Revelation 11 starts dividing this up, you know, that Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles, you know, for 42 months. Like, for instance, in verse 2, but leave the court which is outside the temple and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Okay, so it appears that that's going on in the first half. Although you could argue, you could again make an argument that's happening in the second half also. If all this is happening in the Great Tribulation, again, it's a lot of stuff that's happening in the Great Tribulation. If most people are trying to survive the trumpet judgments, like, I suppose you could argue with, like, say, on the fifth trumpet, the first woe. Remember, that's the demonic grasshoppers come out of the pit of hell, and they're tormenting people, all those, you know, for 5 months. And you could argue, you know, that the witnesses are there. But if the witnesses are witnessing, I mean, how much listening are unbelievers doing to the witnesses if they're in this agony and torment? I mean, are they really listening to somebody preaching a message? I mean, for me, that if you're in supreme agony and and you're spending your time trying to kill yourself, are you listening to a minister? Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. You just have to weigh all those things in your own mind and, like, come to your own conclusion and just kind of tossing your coin and like say, take your best shot. And I wish I could give you something more authoritative, but my reason puts them here because I can't conceive of them having a party just as the Battle of Armageddon is getting ready to be fought. So for me, that's why I put them in the first half. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break. Okay, for a rehash of Revelation chapter 11, mostly, you know, we just focus on who the witnesses were. I wanted you to note that in the first couple of verses, Revelation 11:1 states, "Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the angel stood saying, 'Rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles.'" Okay, so typically when you see an angel taking measurements and stuff, you know, when they're measuring out the temple, God is measuring out what's his, but he's also measuring out judgment. In other words, when God measures, his judgments are going to occur. So measurements indicate judgment. And you also see that in Zechariah chapter 2, where you see measurements being taken. So the two olive trees are the two anointed ones. Again, Moses and Elijah. Yes.
So, like, he's measuring length here, and I just remember, like, a verse I've seen before where it's like, he, like, weighed the hearts and you have been found wanting. So, like, when he weighs stuff, is that like including the judgment thing too? Like, are they synonymous?
Yeah, that's in these two cases they're like parallel, but in Daniel, of course, when that happened, Daniel chapter 6, when that happens, I guess that's and mene tekel upharsin. You know, that again, you know, weighed, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. So your kingdom is being divided between the Medes and the Persians. Again, when you see measurements being taken in that context, just like your measurements are being taken, in that context, judgment is about to occur.
What do the Gentiles have to do with it?
During the last half of the tribulation period, remember that Jerusalem, Israel at the beginning is going to make a mutual defense pact with the Antichrist. So just like Israel was a part of the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago, you know, in the first century, remember, I drew a timeline. I'm going to go ahead and erase this for a second. one thing that is kind of like important to keep in mind. So here's the cross, and like say here's 70 A.D. and here's 130 A.D. And typically from here, usually God's going to measure from here. When the temple is destroyed, keep in mind, look at the political situation 2,000 years ago. And just to really sum this up, to make it really simple so it's just easy to grasp, Rome is in charge. Rome is the empire, they're the fourth world empire of Daniel. They are in charge at this time. At the cross, the Messiah was rejected. Of course, that's why he went to the cross. And within that generation, 37 years later, in 70 AD, that generation which rejected the Messiah was cut off. Okay, and then Israel, just 60 years later in 130 AD, now Rome has basically disassembled the Jewish nation. They've killed a good many of the people off. Those who survived, they sold as slaves, took them back to Egypt and sold them as slaves. And basically, remember I said also that at this point right here, 483 years of the 490 years that Israel is supposed to have, the stopwatch ended right here. God clicked the stopwatch off to wait for 7 more years. But politically, Rome is in charge. And then we go in, and then Rome is going to kind of like fall by the wayside. The western branch falls in 400 AD, and the eastern leg is going to fall in, say, 1400 AD, when the Turks finally came in and conquered Constantinople, which was the Byzantine Empire, which is really the eastern leg of the Roman Empire. So Rome just kind of falls into oblivion. And if you can remember the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It's a picture, it's a rhyme of the Roman Empire falling apart. And then over the years of the church age, various monarchs and stuff trying to reassemble the Roman Empire. Charlemagne, for instance, in 900 AD, Napoleon, of course, in the 1800s, Adolf Hitler, of course, during World War II. Remember, the Third Reich was supposed to be the third millennium of the revived Roman Empire. All these monarchs trying to put it back together, but of course God, nobody could put Humpty Dumpty back together again. In other words, all the pieces are broken, but yet various portions of the Roman Empire were ruling in the world at one time or another. For instance, Spain. In the 1400s, 1400s and 1500s, Spain basically was the dominant power in the world in that day. And then, of course, England rose up, and then they were the dominant world power. I mean, all these members that were part of the old Roman Empire would rise up, and they'd have these worldwide empires. And then, of course, during the American Revolution, of course, it's a war that we supposedly won, but thank God, Great Britain was in a world war at the time. They were fighting all over the world. And they were saying, why should we fight other Englishmen and stuff like that? Let's just learn our mistakes and we'll just leave. And basically and we win the revolution because they just basically, it wasn't worth it. Because it's easy to conquer somebody, but holding on to what you've conquered, if the people don't want to be ruled, they figured even back then, like in position papers, you get in diplomacy and stuff, they figured they would need 1 soldier for every 2 people in the American colonies. And they said it's not worth it. So basically they just left, okay? And so they ruled, and then of course, France ruled a good part of the world and stuff like that. All that stuff's happening during the church age. And then, of course, at the end of the church age, which is where we are, we see now Europe and portions of the Roman Empire coming back together. It's kind of like by itself. They're not going to war to put it back together. They're just kind of like getting together. And mostly because they, like I know when we were in Europe, they looked to Europe and they noticed, wow, United States, it's made up of French and Germans and English and people from all over the world, and they seem to get along and they hold their country together. And then so like it's inspiration for them in Europe. Why can't we do that too? And so it's like it's some inspiration for them to put their empire back together. So it'd be a whole different lesson, but kind of like at the right time now, Rome is coming back together again. The Roman Empire, but remember, we only look at the western leg on this because we're from the West, and so obviously the western part's got to be the strongest and the best and all that stuff. That's how we figure it because we're provincial, and of course it's people like us. We're the ones that are, you know, so obviously that's why we say the Antichrist has got to come from the West, because he's got to come from where everybody's the smartest and most advanced and stuff. I mean, that's how we think. So that's typically why you would see the Antichrist coming from, say, France or Germany or something like that. But anyway, as you see, as Israel remember, Israel is disbanded. Israel disbanded. Or let's just say Israel no more. No more nation. And then in 1948, we have Israel again. And at the same time that Israel's becoming a nation, you start to see the vestiges of the Roman Empire coming together again. But remember, keep in mind, we're only the western leg. Remember, Britain and France and Germany and Italy and all those particular countries are only in the western leg, and that's what we look at, and that's somewhat come together. I mean, they have their treaties. It's a loose confederation, just like it says in Daniel chapter 2, and you know, when you talk about the 10 toes, you know, iron mixed with the miry clay, it's a loose confederation, but it's going to be a very strong union, and so you have a revived Rome. And what you want to sort of see is this interlude. Remember I mentioned in Scripture, this gap in time right here. I just call it 2,000 years for lack of a better number to put on it. But say for 2,000 years, there has been this gap. And of course, that is the church age, that age of the church. When we finally get to the point where, remember, because like for a while right here, remember the church is here. Israel and the church are coterminous back here. We are coterminous with Israel right now, okay? But for a long time, 1,800 years, there was no Israel, there was just the church. Israel was scattered in all the nations of the earth. So now we're coterminous with them right now. And as we're here right now, we look at world events and we see the shadow of the revived Roman Empire. And if you study the political situation back here, I mean, other nations besides Rome, because remember there was the Parthian Empire, which is the remnants of the old Persian Empire. I mean, where are we doing all of our fighting right now? The remnants of the old Parthian Empire, that's where the Medes, the Persians, the Babylonians, all of those other empires which are going to be prominent in the book of Revelation, they're in the news every day now. I mean, that's where all of our terrorists and stuff are basically mostly coming from those areas, out of that portion of the Roman Empire and out of the old Persian Empire. And as you look at those nations that are being revived, by the way, Persia, when did they, ancient Persia only changed their name to Iran in 1933. But in the days of Christ, they were the Parthian Empire. So all those nations are reviving. So you had all those nations here, or the remnants of them. And now, on this side, those nations have a national identity and they're coming back again. So, remember, we have 483 years out of the 490, and we're still looking for 7 more years. Let's just say 7 more years here. 7 plus 483 is 490. So there was a particular situation here. Israel didn't want to have anything to do with Rome. But when we get around to the revived Roman Empire, and after the, well, anyway, what I'm trying to explain here, you look at this political situation here, look at the political situation as it's developing gradually in the world today. And then God's going to rapture the church. Church is gone. Remember, we are an interlude in history. 24 times in the scripture it says that we are a parenthesis in history. And once the church is removed, pretend like it didn't even exist, and there's going to be Rome and Israel, and there's going to be Israel again and revived Rome. Just kind of slide this together, and it's almost going to be like the church was never there. It's like when the Messiah was rejected, when the Messiah was rejected, God terminated Israel. When they're getting ready to receive their Messiah, God brings them back in the same situation they were in before. They were under the domination of Rome, and in the tribulation period, they're going to be under the domination of Rome again. In other words, it's like, we're going to do the last 7 years, we're going to continue right where we left off. Where were we 2,000 years ago? Oh yeah, Rome was in charge. So now the church is gone, and now all of a sudden, Israel is making a mutual defense pact with the Antichrist. And now Rome is in charge again for the last 7 years. So you got that, the political situation, which was kind of like here, is just here in a more modern form. Same nations and everything. So that's why you can look for Babylon to rise. You can look for, modern day Iraq. I look, for instance, the northern part of Iraq and Iran and stuff like that. The country of, the Medes. That's those people in northern Iran and Iraq. Remember that group of people there that just want their own country, but they don't have one, and they want to become an independent country there. The Kurds, they're the modern descendants of the ancient Medes. Remember, they were allied with the Persians at one time. And you see all these nations, and then of course Assyria, northern Iraq. I kind of look for, because Assyria is going to be a major player in the millennium. I kind of look for ancient Assyria to rise up and become a nation again, because all those nations that were in the ancient world, it's like God's reviving. I don't know if they'll have the same names, but some of them are picking the same names. So I don't know how I got off on that. I was doing something else. The times of the Gentiles. The Gentiles were in control, and now the Gentiles are going to be in control again. And remember, Israel's looking for the Messiah where they're going to be the head of the nations, but the Gentiles are in control. So what God is saying here is that during this 7-year period, when he's measuring out the court of the Gentiles, or when he's describing that, he says, but leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles. In other words, it's going to be under Gentile domination until Christ comes back. So in other words, Antichrist and other Gentile nations are going to be ruling in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount until Messiah comes back. There's going to be, at the start of the tribulation period, there's going to be a new temple, because there has to be a temple in Israel in order for the Antichrist to walk into the temple and proclaim himself to be God. In other words, there has to be a temple in order to have sacrifice and grain offering. You can't have animal sacrifices and all the temple rituals and stuff without a temple.
And there is no temple right now.
And there is no temple right now.
And it would take a long time to build a temple, right?
Actually, all the pieces are pretty much ready to go. All the implements inside the temple have already been made and everything like that. For instance, there's a 6-foot golden menorah that's already in Israel already. There's they've already identified who the descendants of Aaron are. Turns out they have a genetic marker that identifies them as sons of Aaron. They've already identified who the priests are, the Levites. And what they haven't done is, like, you hear these rumors where they're still looking for a cow, a red heifer that has to be 100% red. It can't even have one white hair on it. And they're still looking for that because they need the rest of the implements in order. In other words, to make the cleansing material and stuff, you have to burn the red heifer and all that stuff and have the ashes of the red heifer. They have to have all of that to get it started, but they've already made the incense for the temple. All that stuff is ready to go. They're just waiting for the time, and then the temple will go up very quickly. I mean, we don't know whether we'll see it come up first, and possibly it could be on the Temple Mount, not in the same place as the Dome of the Rock, but just on the mount. But all we know is, for whatever reason, when Antichrist makes that defense pact, maybe it's perhaps that he is able to have some sort of truce with the Muslims in order that the Jews are able to have their temple on the mount along with the Dome of the Rock. Or like Moshe Dayan said in 1967 when they retook Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and they talk about rebuilding the temple and the destruction of the Dome of the Rock. He just said, well, perhaps there'll be an earthquake, and then we'll just rebuild our temple. And so they do all that excavation on the Temple Mount. All we know for sure is that there will be a temple there during this period. There has to be, in order for the prophecy to be fulfilled. And all the stuff we're looking at is just how all that stuff's coming together. But it's not described in the Bible about how this stuff sort of comes together. We just kind of watch this. We just watch the flow of history, and we just notice that all these situations are kind of like all those ancient things are starting to happen here too. I mean, we're already back to the center of the earth right now, which is, of course, Israel is the center. Israel is the geographic center of the earth. That area right there. If you take all the land masses in the world, divide them all up into a grid, like say 1 mile square each, and then measure each one to Israel, it turns out that the shortest distance, average shortest distance of to any place in the world, Israel is the shortest distance of any other place in the world. From the average distance from some place on the globe to Israel is shorter than, say, other places. So it's actually the geographic center of the earth in the land masses and stuff. So God is just getting all of that ready, and during this portion in Revelation chapter 11, he's just saying that all the way through the tribulation period, it's going to be turned over to the Gentiles until Messiah comes back and frees it. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Okay. Or whether I was answering another question that I had in my own mind. I don't know. Okay.
Wait, I don't get that last thing you said about Israel being like the center.
Okay.
Could you like draw something?
Okay.
To explain it?
Sure. There's a paper that the Institute of Creation Research actually put out in the 70s on that, but I'll kind of like, I'll try to explain it this way. Obviously, we have to have a picture this as a globe and not just a circle, and let's just say Israel's right here or something like that. I'm just going to put one point here. But basically, picture in your mind a globe of the world, and then all the land masses. Go ahead and divide up those land masses into 1 mile squares. Or say for those of you in another country, 1 kilometer squares or something. Because it really doesn't make any difference how big the squares are. And so you take all these squares, they're basically all the land masses in the world. Basically you've just divided up into 1 mile squares or 1 kilometer squares, and then you measure the distance to Israel. Okay, and so you get all these numbers as you say you take all these millions of measurements to Israel, okay, and then you average them together, and you get a certain number. In other words, you take all those millions of square miles where you measured a straight line from there to Israel. Understand? Okay, now you're going to average those. In other words, you take all those millions of square miles, in the distances, and now you're going to average the distance. In other words, what is the average distance from any point on the earth to Israel? And say, I'm just going to,
Any point on land.
on any point, from any point on the earth, what is the average distance? You take all the points on the earth and you measure from that point to Israel. Now you take all those millions of points and you average them together, and you'll get a certain number. Does that make sense? Huh?
What do you mean by average?
Add them up and divide them. Yeah, you add up all the numbers and divide them by the number of squares, which would be in the, say, 12 or 15 million, whatever, how many square miles of land there is on the earth. It turns out, then you take any other of those millions of marks, and you take the average distance to that mark. And it turns out that Israel will have the shortest, in other words, it'll be a shorter distance to Israel than any other point on earth.
So let's see if I get this right. So what you're saying, okay, we divide the earth in square miles, right? Little square, okay. And so it's 8,000 miles, right? So we got and then whatever the distance at. So we got a finite number of slots that there are, that can be counted. And by measuring different.
But it's not,
places of the earth.
okay, but it's not 8,000. It's like, say if Israel's here, and the United States is here. There's Mexico, all from Mexico, okay. Here's Canada, okay. Here's the land, okay. Here's okay. I know it's bad, but okay. But remember, the second and third largest countries in the world are here and here. I mean, there's some dispute whether we're bigger than China or not, but let's just say Canada is the second largest country in the world. The United States is the third largest country in the world. So if Canada has an area of something 3 million something, and the United States is 3.5 million, something like that. They're pretty close, but Canada's bigger, okay? So if Canada has 3 million, let's just round it off. Canada is 3 million square miles, 3 million square miles. So here's 3 mil. And Mexico down here, 750,000 square miles, okay? So there's 3 million squares in Canada. There's 3 million squares in the United States. There's 750,000 squares in Mexico. You take each one of those. Just say here's one up, in Alaska there, in Canada and Alaska, and you measure there. You take a measurement here. You measure there to Israel. In other words, there's going to be 3 million lines coming out of Canada going to Israel. But then remember, there's Asia over here too, and you're doing the same thing. It just so happens that if you take all those millions of 1 mile blocks, average them together, the shortest distance the average distance from any point on the globe, Israel will be the geographic center of the earth. Say, for instance, if you took Ontario, Canada, right there. We'll just do that, okay? If you measure all those millions of square miles in all those countries, remember there's 3 million here, 3 million here, so some of them are pretty short, like maybe from Santa Barbara to Ontario, Jacksonville, Florida to Ontario, Israel to Ontario. It might turn out that if you average out all those miles square miles all around the globe. Say maybe, I'm just going to pull out a figure. Maybe it's 8,000 miles to average of an 8,000 miles to Israel. But to maybe Ontario, in the little town where'd you grow up? London, Ontario. The average is maybe 8,700 miles. In other words, Israel is the shortest average distance of any place on the globe. In other words, it's the geographic center of the world on the surface of the earth. You can sort of see that if you just look at a globe. You know, you see Asia and Europe and Africa, and you see Israel. Israel is smack dab in the middle of all three of those continents. I mean, you can sort of see it, and the only thing that makes it a little different is when you look at North and South America and Australia and stuff.
What's the name of this article?
I don't remember the name. I got it in storage. It's something that I find interesting that, you know, I have never talked about that in a class before. But it just, God chose to have the gospel go out in the crucifixion in the geographic center of the earth.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's
It
also
just-
supposed to linguistically divide things, like everything to the west of Israel, we read from the left to the right.
Yeah.
And anything the other direction, on the other side of Israel, reads from the right
Yeah.
to left.
Yeah, everybody understand that? If you go east of Jerusalem, people read from right to left. If you go to the west of Israel, you read from left to right.
If you go to the west of any direction, or I mean, if you go to the west, sorry, that sounded super stupid. Don't you just get back to the same point?
Yeah, but all I'm saying is that if you're in Israel, here's west of Israel, here's east of Israel. Just basically speaking, you know, like we all read from left to right. It's a left-hander's nightmare. You know, I'm left-handed. Like I like Hebrew because I can write left-handed. I can write from right to left. I don't smear everything that I write. Okay, that's why left-handers write this way. Okay. Anyway, let me get back to. We're going to be on a break in 10 minutes here. Anyway, Antichrist, the Gentiles are going to be in control of Jerusalem. In other words, they're going to be downtrodden by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And that's not going to, and that will be over at the end of the tribulation period when Messiah comes back and the nation is reestablished with him being in charge. So in other words, he's measuring the court of the Gentiles because the Gentiles are going to be in charge of that until the end. That's all that means. In other words, look at the news stories today. Like for instance, Israel says Jerusalem is the capital of our country. We do not recognize, in fact, no country in the Western world, as far as I know, recognizes Jerusalem as being the capital of their country. We say it's Tel Aviv. So we put our ambassador buildings and all that stuff in Tel Aviv because we don't recognize Jerusalem as being their capital. The Roman Catholic Church says Jerusalem is not the capital of Jerusalem. That should be an international city. So the whole world is basically struggling over Jerusalem. And basically, this says here that the Temple Mount being the center of the city is going to be in the hands of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. In other words, the issue will not get settled. Antichrist will almost settle it with that peace treaty, but he's doing it to trick them. But he rises on the world stage because maybe as we look at the political situation today, he is able maybe to stop terrorism. He's able to end the holy war. Jimmy Carter couldn't do it. President Clinton couldn't do it. Obama's certainly not doing it. They're only making the problem worse. They're not going to solve that issue. But Antichrist will. And so there's going to be peace in Israel. He makes a mutual defense pact. He guarantees them peace for 7 years. Now, think about it. We've been doing all these peace treaties. Maybe it's that peace process. And by the way, every time we talk about peace in Israel, it always involves them giving away their country, giving away portions of their country. By the way, God basically states that when he comes back in Armageddon, God will judge those nations who are dividing his country. Because God said, that's my country. And he's going to judge those people who are dividing up his country. So all that's saying is the Gentiles are going to be ravaging Jerusalem until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, which will be at the end of the tribulation period. That's all that means. Does that help?
And part of the problem with it not having a temple right now is because the territory is in dispute, right?
Yes.
The Jews don't have complete claim. The Palestinians don't have complete claim, and I don't know.
Well, actually, the Palestinians say they do have complete claim, and Israel did have control of the Temple Mount, but in order to instill world peace and to show good favor, basically Israel turned over control of the Temple Mount back to the Muslims. The Muslims, in turn, went in there and they started trying to destroy everything Jewish, destroying artifacts and stuff like that, not allowing Jews to go up there to worship and stuff. So Israel had it, but then they gave it back. I keep saying, no, God gives them victories, and then the world comes in and says, you got to give all that back. I mean, we treat Israel totally different than the way we treat any other nation in the world. I mean, if you really wanted to play by the rules that we play with Israel, remember when Columbus discovered America? I know in Berkeley, they turned Columbus Day, they got rid of the name Columbus, and they said it is Indigenous Peoples Day. And if we did what we're doing in Israel, we would be saying that all of us Europeans and Asians and stuff must go back to Europe, and just because we, after all, didn't we take it? I mean, that's how we treat Israel. You know, they take territory in war or something like that. And again, we treat them totally different. But remember, the Antichrist, his goal is, you know, world domination. Satan wants to be in control of the world. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and then okay. We're kind of back on our diagram again. Here's our 7-year period. Okay, and I'm going to use that kind of like as the base. I tried to make this linear, but in reality, the trumpets would extend more. But I wanted to make the bowls would really be in the last section right here. But if I did that, you'd have a hard time seeing them because it'd just be too small. So just kind of realize that this is kind of stretched out right here so you can see it. And can you see the numbers? Are they still too small?
I can see them.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bowls. See that? See it?
Yeah,
You guys see it?
I can see.
Okay. Okay. We have been reading like one of those Meanwhile Back at the Ranch chapters in chapter 11. And as we get towards the end of it, we talked about the resurrection of the witnesses, being resurrected. They're assumpted up to heaven. But I didn't finish the rest of the chapter, and we're going to do that right now, because it's going to lead into chapter 12, where we have kind of like another vision, and again, it's going to be Meanwhile Back at the Ranch, except instead of talking about the tribulation period, we're going to go back to the end of, we're going to go back several thousand years. Is that on? Huh? Yeah. We're going to go back several thousand years in chapter 12 as we look literally at the history of anti-Semitism. Way back to 2012? Okay. I guess that would be way back to some people. Okay. It says in the same hour, remember, as soon as the two witnesses are resurrected and then they ascend up to heaven, it says their enemies saw them, and in the same hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. What city? Well, obviously they're in Jerusalem, so there's going to be an earthquake in Jerusalem. In the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now, notice this phrase is different than what you'd be reading before. In other times when there's emergencies or tragedies that happen, it states that men cursed God or they blasphemed God. But here they're giving glory to the God of heaven. So that tells you here that a lot of people in Jerusalem, they witnessed this. Obviously a lot of Jewish people too, they witnessed this, And of course, they were literally taking the claims of the two witnesses as being true because they were, well, they were killed, but then they just rose from the dead and they ascended up into heaven. Then there's this earthquake, 7,000 people die, and now the people in Jerusalem can actually see God in it. They're actually seeing God. And so since they're giving glory to God, that means that they're turning their lives over to Jesus Christ. In verse 14 of chapter 11, it says, "The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly." So there was a lot of information. Chapters 10 and 11 happened, after chapter 9. Obviously, 10 and 11 come after 9. Remember, in chapter 9, the sixth trumpet, remember, which is the second woe. So here's our sixth trumpet. Remember, the first woe, second woe, third woe. So the first woe is the fifth trumpet. The second woe is the sixth trumpet. The third woe is the seventh trumpet, which of course is all the seven bowls. So the third woe, the seventh trumpet, encompass the seven bowl judgments. So I'm going to read like towards the end of the sixth trumpet. I'm going to skip over chapters 10 and go towards the end of 11 so that I'm taking out those two, meanwhile back at the ranch chapters, so that you can kind of like see the flow of what's happening chronologically. Because remember, chapter 11 is going and it's telling you what was happening over a period of time, over the witness of that 3.5-year period, whether it was here or here, to weigh the evidence and decide. I think it's here, but we're actually going to go get back on the chronological line now, and we're going to follow the chronology. But remember, the sixth trumpet, or the second woe, remember, was that demonic army of 200 million that kill 1/3 of the earth. Okay, so let me just kind of put that up here. Remember the fifth woe, the demons from the locusts from hell. And remember, they torment people for 5 months. That's a 5-month period. That's why I got a little gap right here. In the second woe, you have a 200 million demonic army. And remember, they kill 1/3 of the earth. I'll put people. So pretty close to 2 billion people die at that point, yes.
What point is it too late for people to turn to Christ?
When he comes back.
That'll be after the seventh bowl.
Christ comes back here.
Okay.
At the end, at the end of the seventh bowl. And as we read the seventh bowl, you'll start seeing Armageddon's getting all ready to be. Actually, Armageddon is being set up in the last couple of bowls right there. So in this 200 million demonic army, they kill off 1/3 of the people that are left on the earth. So, pretty close to 2 billion people are going to be killed at this point right here. Okay. Oh, by the way, as people throughout this period from here on, as those people receive the mark of the beast, it's too late for them. If you receive the mark of the beast, it's too late, because basically you've literally turned yourself over as being belonging to Satan. But there's going to be a lot of people, they're just not going to do it. In other words, they won't be able to hold a job, they won't be able to buy or sell or anything like that. But they just don't know whether they want to receive the mark or not, because that's going to be a decision that's going to affect their whole life, as we'll see when we get to Revelation chapter 14. But as we look at chapter 9 towards the end here, in verse 13 of chapter 9, it says, "Then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar." So anyway, these four angels that have prepared the time for these 200 million demonic army to kill 1/3 of the earth. Remember, they kill with those who sat on them, on these horse-like creatures, had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. The colors and the smells and the odors of hell, by the way, of the lake of fire. Heads like lions, and out of their mouth came fire, smoke, and brimstone. By these 3 plagues, a third of mankind was killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone. In other words, in the first and the second woe, basically God is giving, so far, the unrepentant people on the earth, in order to try to turn them, he's giving them a taste of what it will be like for the rest of eternity in hell by sending these 2 supernatural invasions upon the earth. Okay, so that's the 6th trumpet or the second woe. They're the same thing. As we get towards the end of chapter 11 now, verse 11, verse 14. Now it says, the second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. So now we're back on the chronology again. The second woe, or the 6th trumpet, is over. That is past. Okay? And now the 7th trumpet is coming quickly. Verse 15. Then the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones fell on their faces and worshipped God, saying, we give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was and who is to come, because you have taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come in the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets, and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. Okay, so they're praying, and they're giving thanks to God right about the time that the 7th trumpet or the third woe is going to be unleashed, because now the time is almost at an end. We're getting, in other words, we are wrapping up this 7-year period. And so there's going to be a tremendous amount of judgments that's going to occur that will be absolutely devastating, any 1 or 2 of them being enough to kill everybody on the earth. So they happen in a very short period of time. There's one key phrase in verse 18. One of the reasons why God is judging the earth is listed right here, that God is going to destroy those who destroy the earth. So it says, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. So God is also laying it on man's stewardship of the earth. You know, that man has basically not done a good job as being stewards of the earth. And so God will destroy those who destroy the earth. In other words, in judgment. Because remember, we're stewards of the creation. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were, again, lightnings, noises, thunderings, and earthquake, and great hail. Okay, so now not only is there the thunder and the lightning and stuff, there's also a great earthquake, and now there's going to be tremendous hailstones falling all over the earth from the skies. By the way, lots of times when they actually talk about the hailstones, they talk about them as being like a talent in weight. In other words, these are 75-pound stones, blocks of ice coming out of the sky. Now, my brother just went through a hailstorm in Aurora, Colorado, just outside Denver. He had a new roof. He just put a new roof on his house. His car was parked outside. It broke out a couple of the windows of his car. And by the way, these were golf ball size hailstones. They destroyed the new roof. The vinyl siding on the house, they had to replace a lot of that. In other words, when these things are coming down just from cloud level, came down with enough force that it could literally pierce the vinyl siding on his house, break the windows of his car, and literally tear up a brand new roof. And these are just golf ball size. My brother said, didn't dare go outside. But remember when Joshua, there's that battle and says God starts firing down hailstones at the people, and it said more people died from the hailstones than from the sword. Gives you an idea of how devastating that can be. Then we get to chapter 12, okay? So the seventh angel is sounded. Again, there's that warning. Remember, there's the earthquake and everything. So it's like if the world is lulled into a sense of sleep, especially after a third of the world being dead, now we have, of course, the seventh angel blowing, and the action starts again. So God wakes everybody up with an earthquake. So again, nobody's allowed to get too much rest. Now remember the context here. The third woe is just finished. Remember, chapters 10 and 11 are meanwhile back at the ranch, is giving you other information that's happening. Chapter 10 is the angel in the angelic realm. He's claiming planet Earth for Christ. And chapter 11 is talking about the two witnesses who have been giving a witness during the tribulation period. But remember the context after the third woe. There are pretty close to 2 billion rotting human corpses lying around the world at this time. Obviously, a lot of them centered in cities and stuff like that. So you have to imagine the stench as being unbearable in a lot of places. So that's the kind of the context, as now the third woe comes, and the third woe is much worse than the first two. And remember, the second woe killed 2 billion people. But now, it's like God says, now God is saying, okay, now we're going to send the heavy artillery. Now you get the tough stuff, is basically what he's saying. But then we go again into a meanwhile back at the ranch. Because between every, like 6 and 7 and stuff like that, you're going to have these, you're going to regress, and God's going to go back and he's going to describe the big picture to you. And he's going to do that in chapters 12 and 13 and 14. If I was going to read, like say for instance, the seventh trumpet is sounded, I can tell you what goes on in chapter 15, but then in Revelation chapter 16, just to let you know. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, go out and pour out the bowls of the wrath of God on the earth. And then it's going to go through, very quickly in chapter 16, it's going to go through and describe each bowl that's being poured out on the earth. So if you wanted to just skip over the meanwhile back at the ranch, you can see the judgments unfold. But then, of course, you'd be missing a lot of why all this stuff is happening. But then, of course, you don't want to lose the context of the flow of the book. So sometimes you can just read through, read the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, so you get the chronological flow. And then you can go back sometimes and then read meanwhile back at the ranch. This is what happened. So now we're going to go back several thousand years in chapter 12. And he's going to do it with a series of symbols. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Okay, that symbol right there is used in Genesis chapter 37. Joseph has a dream. And remember, he has this dream. He talks about, the 11 stars. He's a star and his brothers are stars. And those 11 stars bowed down to him. He said, the sun, moon, the 11 stars, they bowed down to me. And Jacob, Joseph's father, interprets that very indignantly. He's very indignant. He says, well, are you saying that one day we're going to be bowing down before you? Of course, but remember, Jacob kept it in his heart, as he pondered, the meaning of that. But of course, that's, the symbol here is now used in Revelation. And so Jacob, having interpreted what the vision means in Genesis, is basically telling us that this woman with the 12 stars, the sun and the moon, is literally, it's the nation of Israel. So now we have Israel, and Israel is about to give birth to the Messiah. She's in pain to give birth. Okay, now we have another sign in heaven. And another sign appeared in heaven, verse 3, behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. Okay, now we're going we're traveling over a lot of history. So we start off like in Genesis, and we're looking at 1800 BC. Now we're all the way up to where the woman Israel is about ready to give birth to the Messiah, and the dragon is hovering over her, waiting to devour the child. Now we know historically, of course, what happens is, that Herod was waiting, he wanted to kill the child. So we have a picture of that in the Gospels, specifically Matthew, but in Revelation it just shows that the person behind Herod is Satan himself. He's waiting to devour the child. But now we're going to actually go through the life of the child, and we're going to jump from his birth to his ascension into heaven. And so now it says, she, Israel, bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. So now we have a picture, says he's going to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Psalm 2. That's the Messiah who's going to rule the world in the millennial kingdom. So we just skip over the life of Christ. We go from his birth to his ascension into heaven. In other words, he's caught up to heaven, to God and his throne. But he's eventually going to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So during this time right here, the child was born. Now we're going to jump ahead 2,000 years to the tribulation period, and we're going to see that the woman at this point right here is going to flee to a hiding place prepared by God for 1,260 days. In other words, 3.5 years. So the woman, Israel, flees to this place. And you can read about this, for instance, in Matthew chapter 24, starting at verse 15. And then there shall be great tribulation. Remember, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. In other words, God wants you to understand it. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the wilderness. And he talks about how desperate the situation is, because Jesus says, for then there shall be great tribulation which shall come upon them. And there's not going to be a time on the earth that will ever be as bad as this period right here. So basically, and then Christ gives a warning, but woe to that person, pray that your flight not be on the Sabbath, and pray that you're not nursing a child, because if you are, probably won't make it. If you're on the roof of your house and you jump down to get your coat, you won't make it. So he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, he says that take that and flee to the mountains. Okay. Revelation chapter 12 talks about that using symbols. Okay. So the woman flees for 1,260 days. Here's 1,260 days. So Israel, in other words, those who believe the promise of God flee, and they're going to be protected in the mountains. In other words, Antichrist is not going to be able to get to them, but he's going to try. Now it states, now it's going to go back and it's going to talk about how Satan's going to be tossed out of heaven. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out. Okay, now if you want to identify who the dragon is, I actually had a Southern Baptist minister said, now this is not Satan. Okay, you can't really, you can't really identify the dragon as being Satan. So I would read this verse and one other one. It says, so the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. That's pretty identifying, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, if words mean anything, the great red dragon is Satan. Okay. When I get through 12, I'm going to go back and we're going to look at the great red dragon. Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Okay, so here's a picture of what happens. Heaven's up here, okay. Okay, and I have to kind of describe, as Satan's being cast out, a lot of people get this confused with Christ. Remember when Christ said, I saw Satan fall from heaven, like a star, coming down, like a star falling out of the heavens. Okay, that's not what this is. But a lot of people confuse them, and so they're going to think that Satan is already cast out of heaven. He has no access to the heavenlies. But remember, it mentions, that Satan is constantly up there in heaven before the throne of God, accusing Jeff for all the sins that he commits as a Christian. I've just got to pick somebody. See how that? Good. Okay. No, I don't know anything about your life, but so he is accusing each and every one of us before the Father in heaven every time we have a shortcoming. And then Jesus, our defense attorney, says, yes, but remember, Father, that on such and such a day, Jeff received me as his personal Lord and Savior. And so the Father basically says, case dismissed, because his sins are under the blood. But there's going to be a war in heaven. Remember, here's how I like to describe it. In Genesis and in Ezekiel 28, remember, Satan was the anointed cherub, okay, especially Ezekiel 28, Isaiah chapter 14. Satan is the anointed cherub, and remember, you got to think of him as like Narcissus. He looks at himself, and it's like he looks in the mirror and says, wow, I am tremendous. And that's what Ezekiel 28 says. He became enamored with his beauty and his wisdom. And then remember the 5 I wills in Isaiah chapter 14. I will ascend, Basically he wanted to basically take the throne of God. He said, I should be ruling. And so basically he lost his cherished position in heaven. And in Ezekiel 28, let me just read 2 verses there. It's a really nice picture of what happened up here in heaven and how Satan fell. And this is going to be a fall that happened before this war in heaven during the tribulation period. So in verse 14 of Ezekiel 28, let me start at verse 11. Moreover, the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God. And now he's going to talk about the anointed cherub. Okay, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. Now that might sound as poetic language, and so you think, wow, you think of this creature, he's studded with all of these jewels and gold and all that stuff, and then it says the workmanship of your timbrels and pipes. Wow, now he's like a pipe organ or something like that. So, but it's poetic language. So what does it describe? It's when the jewels are being used, it's describing the glory that Satan had. You have to picture these as the light that emanates from these jewels. In other words, there was just like this rainbow of glory that emanated from this anointed cherub, the worship leader in heaven, okay? In other words, the jewels is a poetic way of describing the glory that surrounded him. In other words, the glory that came out of his being. When it talks about the workmanship of your timbrels and your pipes, when God prepared them, he was prepared to be a worship leader, and it's describing his voice. In other words, he was built to be able to sing. In other words, he would be leading worship amongst the starry host of heaven. In other words, amongst all the angels of heaven, he was the worship leader that was in charge of giving praise to God. In other words, he was equivalent to the 4 living creatures. He was equivalent to one of them. He was the anointed cherub that covers. In other words, what are those 4 living creatures? They're seraphim, cherubim, in other words, whichever name you want to use. Satan was one of them. There was 5, now there's 4. And then he says in verse 14, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In other words, you were in my government. You were basically very high up in the chain of command. You were an angel of great authority. You walked back and forth amidst the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. And then it talks about how he sinned. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God. In other words, you have been banished from my government. No, you are no longer in the chain of command. And I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart, verse 17, was lifted up because of your beauty. That's how he started off. Picture him as Narcissus, looking at a mirror and being amazed at his great beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. Okay, and then of course, by the way, what happens after this is all future. It has not yet happened. So that's why I stop right there. But there was that time where he was cast out of heaven. It was before, sometime after Adam and Eve were created, but before they fell, Satan is enamored with his beauty. He loses his position as the anointed cherub. In other words, he got fired, lost his job. He is no longer the anointed cherub, but he still has access to the heavenly premises. He can still go before the throne of God. If you can picture yourself having a job and you just got full of yourself, and so your boss, the company, fires you, but yet you still have access to the company. You can still walk around, talk to people, and you can make your rounds and stuff like that, but you don't have any authority up there. But finally there comes a point where now the owner of the company says, I don't want to see that guy around here anymore. Kick him out and lock the gate. Don't let him back in. That's what happens at this point right here. In our chronological timeline, the war in heaven happens right here. And Michael is now going to war against Satan and a third of the angels, in other words, all those who rebelled with Satan, and they will be cast to the earth. They no longer have access to the heavenlies. No longer can Satan go up there and accuse Jeff before God of his sins and stuff like that. By the way, it's not really a good analogy because you're not going to be in the tribulation period, but just say somebody named Jeff up there, and he can no longer do that, okay? So Satan is now cast to the ground. He is now in his own realm. Remember, he's the prince of the power of the air. And so that's where he is right now. And so it says back in Revelation chapter 12 then, does everybody have a picture of Satan there? And if I went back to Isaiah chapter 11, God actually, first, he's enamored with his beauty. His wisdom is corrupted. Well, what corrupted his wisdom? He decided he wanted to be like God. And so basically you can insert that little place in Isaiah chapter 14, 11 verses 11 through 14, insert that at the appropriate place in Ezekiel, and basically you can put the whole thing together. What corrupted his wisdom? When he started thinking he was like God and wanted to take over. So back in chapter 12, let me read the verse 12 again. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. In other words, rejoice heaven. Satan is no longer allowed on the premises. But woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time. Satan knows the Bible too. He knows he has 3.5 years to stop the second coming of Christ. And so he's going to do it every way that he can. And so we start off in verse 13. Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, and that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the woman, Satan goes after, in other words, there's an army that will go after Israel. As Israel flees to the wilderness, the Antichrist is going to send an army, instigated by Satan himself. Remember, the Antichrist will be Satan's man. An army will pursue them. But again, there's going to be an earthquake. The earth is going to open up and that army is going to be swallowed. Now, when the Bible uses a term like a flood, if you go back to, say, a passage like Isaiah chapter 8, during the invasion when Assyria was invading the kingdom of Judah, it describes the Assyrian army as being like a river overflowing its banks, and you as an individual are standing there and the water's rising up first past your ankles, then your knees, then up to your hips, and up to your chest, and finally up to your neck, and you're on your tippy toes and you're looking up and your nose is sticking out of the water, and then the waters recede. So it almost got you, but not quite, because you could still get your nose out of the water and you could still breathe. So it demonstrates, it pictures an army as being like a flood. The woman who gave birth to the male child, of course, is protected because the earth opens up and literally destroys the army that Satan sends out after it. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Go back to Revelation chapter 7. Remember, the 144,000 are doing their witnessing. Most of those people who are being saved are now going to be martyred. Well, this tells you why they're being martyred. He is enraged with the woman, and since he can't get to the woman, he is going to kill all those people who listen to the witnesses, and he's going to try to put as many to death as he can. He goes after the offspring of the woman. Now let's go ahead and take a look at this dragon with the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and the 7 diadems on the 7 heads. So here's our dragon. I gotta make this a little smaller. Great red dragon. Let's make them red. Okay. So here's this dragon with 7 heads. Okay. Okay, these are all heads of the dragon. I can. At least the dragon is red, okay? Okay.
It's like a jester's hat.
I know. Okay. Now, on the head, on one of the heads remember there's 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. On one of the heads, there's 10 horns. Okay. 10 horns on one of the heads. Okay. Remember, this is the dragon's body and all. I don't want to erase this, but here's our great red dragon, 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay. So what do the 7 heads represent? And then, of course, what do the... Okay. First of all, as we look at the heads, it says the dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay. And on the 7 heads, there are 7 diadems. In other words, ruling crowns. So there's a crown on each head.
Actually, Jim, does it say that there's 10 horns on one head, or is it just 10 horns on?
Take this by faith right now, and I will demonstrate to you later that they're all on one head.
Fair enough.
Okay. So this is a description of Satan: 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems, 1 diadem on each head. So what do they represent? Remember, Satan has been the instigating force. He's the god of this world, and basically what each head represents is an empire that Satan was ruling, empires that had tremendous influence over the Jews. So these empires are in order. There's Assyria. These are world empires: Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and revived Rome. Okay. And we're going to discover later on, it's going to, when we look at some other dragons and we look at the beasts, it'll give more information on these. Also in the book of Daniel, this same, the beast is going to be described, but this is the only place where Satan himself is being described. Okay. Can everybody picture this as a dragon now? Okay. It's just a partial view of the dragon. So that's what he looks like there, and I'm just letting you know, cluing you in right now what that means, so that when we get to chapter 13 and I can bump one against the other. By the way, it's Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome. Rome's number 6. Revived Rome is number 7. And actually, revived Rome is going to turn into an 8th kingdom later on. Okay. Okay, so what we have here from the very beginning, then we have a picture of anti-Semitism. In other words, why this hatred for Jewish people? Because remember, it goes all the way back to Genesis 3:15. Remember, the seed of the woman would crush the head of the seed of the serpent. Remember, the male child would have his heel bruised, but by the way, if you think of crushing a snake barefoot or something like that, if I took Kurt, right? If I take you and you're barefoot and you say, I can do this, I'm a big guy, and you're going to crush a rattlesnake, so you're going to do it barefoot. As you're smashing his head, he bites you, but when you put your full weight on, you crush his head, but not before he bites you. So you've killed him, but he's bruised your heel. And basically that's what it's describing. The bruising, of course, of the male child, of course, was at the crucifixion. But of course he rose from the dead. And he's going to crush the head of the seed of the, he's going to crush the seed of the serpent. So that's a picture of, throughout all of history, of, in other words, the satanic influence through all of world history and persecution against God's people, not only the Jewish race, but also all those people who put their trust in the Messiah. That's why Satan doesn't like you. I mean, Satan doesn't like anybody. But if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, he has a particular hatred for you. And the only thing keeping you alive at all is literally the grace of God that's protecting you from him. Otherwise, we have no way to fight Satan. All we can do is resist him, and there's nothing else that we can do. So this basically, in Revelation chapter 12, it's going to give a panoramic history of anti-Semitism throughout the world. During the tribulation period, it gets to a fever pitch because now there's there's going to be even more emphasis on trying to exterminate every Jewish person alive on the face of the earth. And what's the reason for that? The reason, and by the way, we see that several times. What did Pharaoh in Egypt try to do? Kill the male children. What did Haman, the Agagite, in the Persian Empire, he wanted to exterminate the Jewish race. Hitler during World War II, exterminate the Jewish race. Even when they needed the trains to ship troops and arms to the front lines and stuff like that, it was more important for the trains to carry Jews to the ovens than it was to actually give weapons and stuff to his troops. Because what was driving him was a satanic desire to completely annihilate the Jewish race. When Christ is coming back, he has to come back to a Jewish nation to rule the Jews as being the head of the nations. If there are no Jews left on the face of the earth, then prophecy can't be fulfilled.
Now Iran wants to wipe them out.
Yes. And by the way, that desire is spreading. I mean, not only through all the Muslim countries in the world, anti-Semitism is showing up again in Europe again, and Mein Kampf, by the way, is becoming a popular book in Europe again.
Yeah, it's still one of the most, I think, popular in Turkey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What book is that?
It's a book that Adolf Hitler wrote. Adolf Hitler wrote a book about his plan on what he would do to make the world better. Okay, and it's actually starting to happen in the New World too. In other words, anti-Semitism is again rising around the world, and basically at this time it says every nation in the world will be against Israel. Everybody. There will be no place for the Jews to turn. The only place that they will be able to turn is up.
In World War I or World War II, they took 1 Jew out of 3, and according to Zechariah, this time it's going to be 2 out of 3.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, what's coming ahead is going to be far worse. So, that's one of those pictures here. And I only want to cover one of these beasts tonight because when I cover Revelation chapter 13, if you learn this as a point of reference, remember 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. If you can remember that, you have a base in which to fall on, so that when we talk about the others, when I talk about the beast that comes out of the pit, he's going to be a beast that has 7 heads, 10 horns, but 10 crowns. Each horn has a crown on one of the heads. And so we'll just briefly go back to Daniel, and then when we get to Revelation chapter 17, we're going to see a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns and no crowns. I mean, like, what's the difference? So that's why I'm just starting with one. Get one down as a reference point. By the way, one is Satan, one is the Antichrist in Revelation 13, and in Revelation 17, it's the religious system that's in the world at that time. Religion and how does politics and religion fit together? That's Revelation 17 and 18. And you're going to discover that the woman, the harlot that rides the beast, she's riding the beast. In other words, she's controlling the beast, the world system, but yet at the same time she's being supported by the beast, and the beast hates her and wants to kill her, of which of course he's going to do. So it just kind of like gives you an overview of where we're going so that you can understand why all of this is happening. So is there any questions on what we've done so far?
Yeah. I forgot what you call them. You call them diodes?
Diadem. A diadem.
Does it say it in here?
Huh?
Does it say diadem?
No, it says crown, but it's the Greek word diadem. It's what a king wears or a queen or something like that. It means you're ruling. Christians, for instance, when we get our rewards, we talk about getting our crowns. We do not get diadems. We get a Stephanos. So Stephanos, we get our name Stephen or Stephanie from it, and it means it's a victor's crown. It's like a laurel wreath, put around your head, it means you've been the victor in the games. In other words, you competed in the Olympics. Say pick, who wants to be the example?
Me. Make me the example.
All right.
She represents Canada.
What's that? All right, let's pick, all right, Bob, we'll pick you. Bob has just, he's been in the Olympics. The only example given, you know, they give the example of boxing and they give the example of running a race. So let's just say Bob was wrestling or something like that. We'd do something different because they wrestled in the Olympics then. Bob won all his matches. He killed all of his opponents in the wrestling matches. See, in their Olympics, when you pinned them, you killed them.
Sweet.
Yeah. Okay, so now you go up to the Bema seat, and the judge is up there, and you stand before him, looking up to him, and he's going to reward you with your Stephanos. In other words, your crown. You're going to bend over. He's going to put a laurel wreath on your head, showing that you have attained victory. By the way, every one of us, when we get crowns and stuff like that, that's going to happen to each and every one of us as we get a certain number of crowns for whatever, you know, however we lived in faith and did the good works that God asked us to do. That's the difference. So one is a political ruler, and the other one's.
And so these are political rulers.
These are political crowns, diadems. Yeah. In other words, they're ruling. Like for instance, each head representing an empire. The Assyrian Empire was the world power for like 200 years. Egypt was the world power for several hundred years. Babylon for about 100 years. Medo-Persia for 250 years. Greece for a very short time, and then divided into four sections, and it ruled for a couple of hundred years. And then Rome basically ruled for 1,000 years. And then Rome kind of faded away, and then Rome, of course, is going to revive again for a very short time during this period right here. And the Antichrist himself is going to be the head of it. Revelation calls him the beast. Yeah?
All right, so this is Satan and not the Antichrist, right?
This is Satan. In chapter 12, it's describing the great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns.
All right, so the Antichrist is going to be a political figure. So, like, what's this guy going to be?
Antichrist, I mean, Satan himself?
Like,
Satan
we
is...
know him already.
Satan is the god of this age. He's the prince of the power of the air. Satan is the one who's basically ruling the earth right now.
Okay.
In other words, he's ruling those people in the world. Yeah.
But he's been ruling since 3,500 years ago.
Ever since Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
He
When
has no more access to heaven, right?
he, at this point in the middle of the tribulation, he will no longer have access to heaven. He does right now. He has no authority in heaven, but he has access to heaven. So it's like, for instance, when you sin, or if you sin, he will immediately go to the Father and accuse you and bring up your sin to the Father. Jesus Christ is pictured up there as being your defense attorney. And in other words, Jesus is defending you. The Father is like in charge. Satan is the district attorney. He's the one who's trying to get you condemned. Jesus is your defense attorney. He just looks to the Father and says, yeah, but Felipe on such and such a day received me as his Lord and Savior. So he's basically, his sin is under the blood. And of course, then the Father says, case dismissed. Okay.
My other question is, since we're talking about crowns, you know, Paul talks about it in 2 Timothy, where he says, you know, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race. Now is in store for me. I think he says a crown.
Yeah.
But not only for me, but for everyone else who believes in Jesus.
Who looks for his coming.
So those are those Stephanos crowns, right?
Yeah.
That we're talking about.
Yeah, they're the Stephanie crown and the Stephen crowns. Yeah, that's what we're basically working towards as we're living this life on the earth right now. And he was like at the end of his life, he's saying, I have finished the fight, I have finished the race, fought the good fight, and now, in other words, he knew he was going to be rewarded because he was faithful. He said, at the end of my life, I was faithful. In other words, I did everything God asked me to do, is what he was saying. And so waiting for him in heaven was the crown of life. That's the one that he was looking for at that time. Yeah.
So is the Antichrist indwelt by Satan, or is Satan influencing him, giving him his power? I'm a little
Okay, I will go into that extensively next week, but I'm going to present two theories on what the Antichrist, who he is and what he is. Okay? I'm going to present whether or not he's a Nephilim or whether or not he's a man who's possessed by Satan personally. I mean, did he die? Was he resurrected? You know, I'll cover all that stuff next week. Okay. Any other questions before we close? Annalise, anything? Okay. Max? Austin? Okay. Okay. I think if I called on everybody today, I didn't call on you.
That's okay.
Okay. Okay.
Call him now.
Okay. I'm just. Okay. Blessed Heavenly Father, as we thank you as we just cover so much material that we could go so much deeper, but Lord, we can only cover so much. But we would just pray, Lord, that you would give wisdom and understanding for what we have covered, and that the flow, the chronology of this book would begin to really make sense, and not only make sense, but how we would utilize it in our own life to spur us on to good works, to witness, and to lead a life pleasing to you, and that we would be trying to purify our life by what we have learned. In Jesus' name, amen.